Bueno, y es el momento de conocer entonces cuál es el estatus actual del financiamiento de las energías renovables en la zona del Caribe. Para eso vamos a recibir a Joseph Williams, jefe de la Unidad de Energías Renovables y Eficiencia Energética del Banco de Desarrollo del Caribe.
Opportunity to make a contribution to this important Congress. I want to recognize all my colleagues from Caribbean and was asked to look briefly at the matter of the current status of financing for renewable energy in the Caribbean. And I'll just broadly provide an overview of the current status of financing with an emphasis on the key gaps and opportunities. The presentation will draw largely from a study that was done recently in the context of the CSERM framework, Sustainable Energy Financing for CARICOM, Gaps and Opportunities, and this work was done by Cadmus Group. And in the process, I'll provide some perspective from CDB's standpoint, that is Caribbean Development Bank. But before I do that, I just want to use a short time just to introduce, say a little bit about Caribbean Development Bank. Caribbean Development Bank started in 1970. And the main aim of the bank is to be a leading catalyst for development resources in the region towards systematic reduction of poverty in borrowing member countries through sustainable development. The headquarters for the bank is in Barbados. We have an office in Haiti, staff complement of about 230. There are 19 borrowing member countries, which are CARICOM countries and the associate member countries of CARICOM. And then there are some non-borrowing member countries which are listed there: Brazil, Canada, China, Colombia, Germany, Mexico, Italy, UK, Venezuela. We now have a rating based on those agencies of AA, stable. Asset base is just about 1.6 billion US. Loan portfolio is about 1 billion. And relevant to this conversation, the matter of climate resilience and energy security are cross-cutting themes within our strategic plan. What I'm proposing to do is really to start at the back in terms of my presentation. So I'll just skip to the end just to make a few quick comments here about where we are in relation to sustainable financing for renewable energy. So we consider renewable energy and energy efficiency to be very important twins. So even though we are talking about renewable energy, we consider energy efficiency intervention to be an important accompanying intervention. As a matter of fact, generally, the strategy is to encourage countries, projects to consider energy efficiency before, scoping the renewable energy intervention. And as a broad statement in terms of where sustainable financing is, or financing for renewable energy in the region, one could say that much progress has been made. Largely, there is much funding available to support sustainable energy. The significant overarching issue has been that of access for some project developers, some clients, potential clients. And in the context of the private sector, the main challenge that has been identified in the context of the study completed is that of inadequate enabling environment, the whole matter of the regulatory and policy framework as it relates to largely the electricity sector has been identified as a significant barrier for investment in terms of private sector investment. And so that remains a big concern. Generally, from CDB's standpoint, well, the report identified also that there are gaps, some special gaps and opportunities. Certainly for utility scale renewable energy intervention, there is need for risk mitigation mechanism, credit support facilities, especially to support the honoring of the PPAs, the power purchase agreements. For small scale renewable energy, especially in the distributed generation mode, there is need for a mechanism to support scaling up. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then there is need for risk mitigation mechanism for small and micro RE projects, generally speaking. There's generally a gap for supporting R&D type, research and development type research, RE projects. And then it has generally been observed that for the retail end of the market, that is the financing, there's a gap, not sufficiently, not enough of the commercial banking, microfinancing institutions are promoting or supporting the funding of renewable energy projects. And finally, to note that CDB and its multilateral development partners are working on some of these instruments that need to address these gaps. And I'll elaborate on some of those. I thought it useful to start there because I just want to make sure we don't get lost in some of the details. But what I want to do now is just to walk through a bit of some of the challenges and how we get to those conclusions. So basically, the question really could be asked: why is it necessary to have innovative approach to financing for renewable energy? And what we do know is that renewable energy interventions compared to the conventional forms face special risks which form barriers. And so for the power market, we know there's a whole issue of price, the whole question of demand, the off-taker for the power and so on. And some of these projects will have lives of in the region of 20 years. That's the kind of time it's thinking about, 25 years, 30 years. And so it's very important to have the question about what is the price that will be paid for this power delivered in a very clear and certain way for the private investor, which has been identified as an important player, especially in the infrastructure market generally, for these projects to happen. The private sector investment is critical part of this, because we know governments are constrained and will not be able to provide the resources. It's not desirable either, given what we really want to achieve. And so the whole question of the market is a very important issue and form risk around that. Then there's a whole question related to that, of course, policy, regulatory. And then for renewable energy, capacity is an important part of it. Some of the technologies require expertise and strong expertise in some areas in order for the financiers to be confident that the projects will be deployed successfully. We have issues around social acceptance. Environment and social issues are critical for many reasons. I don't want to get into all of those, but especially for some of the technologies, it's very important that some of the safeguards that are articulated are required, especially by multilateral development banks, are met in order for these projects to move forward. There's a whole question of resource and the technology risk, counterparty risk in the context of the utility, and then there's the usual financial sector risks. I mean, those can come in various forms. Of course, there's political risk, change in government, change in policy, change in law. All of these will impact projects, but generally can be more impactful for renewable energy options because of some of the reasons I mentioned before. Then there's a currency, macroeconomic, whole question of foreign exchange. Can I get my currency out? A number of issues around those. But also, I think as we talk about financing options, I think it's very important to understand that renewable energy brings a number of benefits, and the traditional view of financing these projects sometimes don't internalize these benefits. And so there is need for more innovative approaches. In general, innovative instruments will need to address policy de-risking, and we alluded to some of them already, but we'll come back to that. And then financial de-risking, as well as providing direct incentives. Wow, did I do that? Okay. So, traditional versus innovative. It's a question of how the instruments. In some cases, we are using traditional instruments. It's loan instruments, it's grant. It's a question of how these instruments are deployed. The combination and the creativity in the space addressing the specific issues or barriers that can be identified. But the traditional approach is really to use proven instrument in the traditional way. So if the project doesn't fit a certain profile, it's not going to be funded, because the financiers sometimes don't step out of the boundary in terms of understanding some of the things I mentioned before, and so it doesn't meet their profile and it doesn't happen. The whole question of how the risks are viewed, the recognition that REEE projects are sometimes treated as other infrastructure projects. And then, of course, as mentioned before, the barriers and the context are ignored. For innovative financing, it's very important to recognize that the theme covers many, well, the area covers many thematic areas. So renewable energy addresses energy access issues. They address the electricity system issues. Transportation now is emerging as a critical area to be addressed. Energy security in the traditional sense, in terms of availability, reliability, affordability, energy independence, sustainable development goals, and as you know, energy is a critical input for virtually all. And then there are environment and climate change issues, which have a separate and sometimes whole scheme and set of rules. So the point is that recognizing that there are multiple benefits across many areas and many thematic areas, one has to look at the benefits in those contexts and look at the risk in those contexts. And in some cases, it's about what other parties or stakeholders are doing in the space that will help to reduce the overall risk of an intervention of our project. So for example, a project may not pass the bar under traditional financing because of some need for credit risk abatement. To the extent that there are other parties in the market who are providing these instruments, then the financier, recognizing that this approach to renewable energy financing will see the need for partnering and collaborating in order to bring the financing solution to a particular intervention. I use it as an example just to make the point that this idea of innovative financing recognizes a different look at the projects. It recognizes that we are trying to solve the problems, not the traditional problem, but new set of problems, and as such there are different ways of looking at it. So I thought I'd just mention that very quickly. I'll skip through those, but just slide 6 to capture from Irina, it seems to capture that even with some of the traditional instruments, recognizing the x-axis there shows us different stages for the project, but recognizing across the project cycle that there are different actors and who will come at different points can also be a reason for developing an innovative approach. So, in the context of the CARICOM Sustainable Energy Roadmap and Strategy, the CDB chairs the financing committee, and in that context a study was commissioned to understand better the landscape for sustainable financing for renewable energy and energy efficiency. to look at where we are as a region, what the gaps are, and what needs to be done to address those gaps. And it was really also taken into consideration. It also sought to take into consideration the target that was established by CARICOM. CARICOM has established targets to 2027. And the question is, what are the capacity gap, meaning generation, and what will that mean in terms of the financing requirement to achieve those targets? So the study really looked at that, and I have left out some of the details here, but essentially it is saying that to 2027, the region needs to install somewhere around 6.5 gigawatt of electricity generating capacity, and that will require approximately $18.4 billion, $18.5 billion thereabout. But what it also identified is that there is significant flow of resources in the region. Even though it identified, in this case, LAC, Latin America and the Caribbean, it showed that in 2017 there was some $7.2 billion available through different instruments to address sustainable financing. And that really reflected an increase over 2016. It identified 68 sustainable financing instruments, different interventions, instruments, initiatives across a range of institutions and agencies that are supporting financing. And of that, some $59 billion of funds were being passed or available to support sustainable intervention. 3.8 billion debt financing, 1.9 in equity, and there was some 205 million in terms of grant financing and 11.7 million. Now, some of this reflect, the data wasn't fully disaggregated in some areas, but generally it's reflected significantly that there was significant resources available for the Caribbean region. It also identified that public financing remains an important part of the landscape. A lot of the projects still depend on public sector financing or public resources, meaning grant, contingent grant, etc. And I've listed some of the instruments that have been identified there. And it says 47 out of the 48 were depending on some kind of a development financing. As mentioned before, for the private sector, that's a challenge. Of the 68, only 15 of the instruments were utilizing or geared toward private financing. And some of the institutions that are targeted are identified there for debt financing as well as for equity financing. A number of the stakeholders, meaning the consumer types, were identified, and I wouldn't go through all of this, but it's available in the presentation. What's significant were the barriers in the different areas for these different customer type or potential clients, and the whole question of limited access, credit rating for these potential clients. Again, we see the whole question of in the case of the private developers, the IPP, the regulatory framework evolved to be a significant one. And then they also identify a number of instruments that are available and those that are being utilized in the market as we speak, but also some of the issues that they were having. This matter for the commercial and the industrial clients, the facilities, buildings, and so on, is an important one because we believe at CDB that if we're really going to scale up renewable energy, you really have to pay some attention here. But again, there are some barriers there, especially around their ability to access credit and so on. And in that context, there are some instruments that are being looked at. And there are some specific recommendations around addressing some of the gaps. One, the need for aligning the targets in countries with the regional target. The real need for intensive work around the policy and regulatory framework for greater clarity and certainty. The whole question of the role of the public sector in providing leadership with demonstration and communication and awareness. Utility scale, the question of risk capital to support some of the interventions. In the case of distributed generation, the whole question of customer creditworthiness became a big one. And so, like many of our partners, CDB is also promoting a number of what we consider innovative instruments to address some of these issues. One of those has to do with a blended financing instrument where we secure grant resources from EU as well as DFID, blend with CDB loan resources to support intervention in the public sector facilities. Christian Gisler spoke about the collaboration we have with IDB and some other partners around geothermal. And the instrument there, the contingent recoverable grant instrument, has been a significant one in moving those developments forward, but we think is also applicable to other renewable energy options as we go forward. We have a climate action line of credit with EIB. I saw my colleague from EIB somewhere here. And that is a kind of an interest rate subsidy for our normal ordinary capital resources. So you end up with an overall lower effective interest rate, better terms. And then we have been accredited to the Green Climate Fund, and through that means we are hoping to create a number of innovative instruments. Just want to mention, and I see your indication, I just want to mention two instruments that we think are very important. One is what we call the ESCO model, and to cut it short, we're really exploring with CARICOM Secretariat, Devon Garden and Simon Zellner from GIZ, are two of our counterparts. We're looking at an instrument to support on-bill financing with the utilities. Electric utility is an important player there. So you would utilize the vendors as expert in the market as well as the utilities expert and leverage the use of the utility bill as a means of financing instruments and financing intervention, sorry. And then there is the question of the need for a partial risk guarantee mechanism mentioned earlier. And in this regard, the CARICOM Development Fund is pursuing an instrument that's called the CRAF, Caribbean Risk Abatement Facility, that is seeking to address partial risk around smaller developers and MSMEs and so on, the micro facilities. On the right, I've shown a chart which has shown CDB's lending portfolio since 2015 to 2018 in energy sector. And what you have seen there is since we have started our new strategy around sustainable energy, the lower graph shows what the proportion of our sustainable energy financing has been in that region. And so this remains a very important area for us, and we're building a significant portfolio there. This captures a summary of the IUS model I just mentioned, where the utility plays an important role, the technology provider, and of course it's done in the context of the regulator, and it has the flexibility to be done in the context of an unregulated space, but we think this is a very important instrument. Similarly, this partial risk abatement mechanism is another one that is being pursued in the region, led by the Caribbean Development Fund, and we're also collaborating with them because we think this is very important in terms of scaling things up. Since I covered this when I started, I think I can stop right here, and those are the main points in terms of where we are in terms of the landscape. I think we have some ways to go, but we have made some progress. We have identified where the key gaps are, and I think the importance of partnership is going to be a very important strategy for all institutions, given the multiple themes covered by renewable energy development, but also the different barriers and risks that spread across different areas and thematic focuses. Thank you so much for listening.
Muchísimas gracias al señor Joseph Williams, jefe de la Unidad de Energías Renovables y Eficiencia Energética del Banco de Desarrollo del Caribe. ¿Tenemos algunas preguntas para él? ¿Alguien se anima? No questions for you.
Okay.
¿Alguna pregunta? Bueno, pues, sí, hay una pregunta aquí. Por favor, aquí delante.
So, yeah, well, my name is Albrecht Tiedemann. I'm from Renewables Academy from Berlin. We offer trainings also for the financing sector worldwide. And what we recognize that because the fuel for wind and solar is totally different from the fuel for gas and oil, and so that especially the question of risk assessment and due diligence is totally different when it comes to the financing of wind and PV. How much need do you see for the financing sector, means in training on financial due diligence and risk assessment for especially wind and PV? And does your bank offer any support for other banks or for the private sector, means trainings on financial due diligence and risk assessment?
Okay, shall I go? Thank you for the question. And I may have emphasized this whole question of capacity when I spoke about some of the risks which form barriers, because that's an important and a critical component. So it was there somewhere, but I didn't emphasize it. So I think your question touches on that area generally. And so let me just use the opportunity to say that, so when we talk about innovative financing, it's about packaging responses to meet those needs to overcome the barriers. So in this case, you're right on the ball in terms of identifying that gap. So typically, for our due diligence process, meaning CDB and most of the development banks, that would be an important element. So we wouldn't do a project without answering that question. Is there sufficient capacity to ensure that this intervention can be deployed successfully and be sustainable? So you're right. So we recognize that and we try to help the institutions with that. So to answer your question specifically, yes, there are some resources we have available. We have a $5 million Canadian fund that is dedicated significantly to building capacity, supporting due diligence process as one of them. We now have some new lines. Even with the EIB line that I just mentioned, there's a capacity component. And we have a clear strategy to engage with the development financing institution in country, at national level, to support them. So all the lines that we provide to them, that's an important component, and that's part of the package that we sell in trying to overcome the barriers that we identified. So it's pointed, it's right on, and it's a central part of strategy. Thanks.
Okay. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? ¿Alguien más? Bueno, pues muchísimas gracias al señor Joseph Williams, jefe de la Unidad de Energías Renovables del Banco de Desarrollo del Caribe. Gracias.